Hello and welcome. This is your host, Enrico E. Manalo, with another episode of Intentionally Act Live. I'm here today with Dr. Martin. Hello, Dr. Martin. How are you?
I'm good. How are you, Rico?
Doing very, very well. Thank you. I feel so good. I decided to wear orange today, reflect the warmth of the day, I guess.
Is that what's happening right now?
Yeah, that's what's happening right now.
Okay.
That's what I'm saying is happening right now. But thank you so much for joining me. Our astute viewers will note that this is a little bit different than our regular shows. Regularly, we have guests whose minds and work that we really want to elevate in relation to racial equity. What we're doing today is we're actually doing something of a response video. And that means that we are going to be watching a video live with all of you. And this video is actually from the 1950s, from 1956, in fact. And it's a televised debate between international high school students who are in an exchange program in the US, and they are talking about prejudice. So this video actually went viral on online not too long ago, in part due to the young Filipino man in the video. This got picked up in the Philippines, and a lot of people were just really, really impressed by the eloquence and the logic that's put together behind these debate arguments. And a lot of people are kind of drawing comparisons to the level of rhetoric today, which seems very much centered around like sloganeering, and there's maybe not such a sophisticated sense of the arguments that build toward that very distilled set of arguments that become a slogan. And so that's one of the reasons why we wanted to bring this video to our audience, so that we could kind of pick it apart a little bit and connect it to where we are today, and most especially in the workplace. So I don't know. You've watched this video as well, Dr. Martin. I don't know if you've got any kind of introductory remarks that you'd like to say before we start in.
Only thing I'll add is I think it is whether or not you agree with the positions that the young people take in the video. I think what's really interesting is the fact that they are having an open public debate on issues in a structured way that allows for a little bit more depth of the ideas. There's still some things that get glossed over, but I think it's very different from a political debate where you're going kind of back and forth. But really kind of a bit more substantive. And I think it's really exciting to see young people stepping into their power and being able to express themselves and have to get knowledgeable about the issues that that are prominent and affecting their communities and other communities around the world.
Yeah, and I mean, to your point on the difference between a high school debate and a political debate, one of the things that I was shocked by was because I had that political connotation in my mind when I watched it, but there was no kind of animosity or personal attacks or anything like that, which unfortunately has been a feature of our most recent presidential debate.
I might disagree with you a little bit. I think there was some. It might not have been like interpersonal in a sense where like I'm attacking you as a person, but I think there were some like ideas that were put out there that were like, barbs, but it's more fun to watch because it's more intellectual.
Right. Yeah. It's somewhat elevated, I would say.
Yes. It's the next level up in the hierarchy of argumentation.
Oh man. Okay. Yeah. The fact that 2020's politics does not quite match the level of discourse of a 1950s debate. Well, I guess we'll see what we're talking about.
Yes, and one other caveat I'll add to this is like the relevance to, I think, the workplace, right? So this idea that we're trying to have conversations about racism in the workplace, and what are the challenges, what are the realities, what are the perspectives, where are there opportunities to be more sophisticated in how we are talking about issues and understanding different perspectives and multiple realities and the complexity ultimately that exists in trying to understand how racism is impacting us as individuals and how it's impacting our workplaces.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So let's jump in, shall we?
To our forum discussion on the roots of prejudice. We'll be talking about what our prejudices are, where they came from, how they're nourished, and perhaps even how to get rid of them. Let me introduce you to the 4 student participants in today's discussion. Ratnati Iskandardinata, high school student, 17 years old, and also a talented dancer from Indonesia. From Japan, Yoriko Konishi, whose lovely voice you've just heard. From time to time, we like you to get a sense of what we do in all those times when we aren't having serious discussions. We very often get Yoriko to dance or sing for us. She does both. From the United Kingdom, 18-year-old Judith Reeder. Judith's got a bit of a cold today. It did not come from swimming in the Atlantic Ocean, although she assures us that when she's in England, she does swim in the ocean during the winter. From the Philippines, Raul Contreras. Raul will be 16 years old, patriotically enough, on the 4th of July. He may admit some prejudices, but one he obviously doesn't have is a prejudice against women, or he wouldn't have been willing to appear tonight with 3 women being the only male on the program. Now, on this question of prejudice, perhaps we ought to start out by trying to define what you think prejudices are. What do you think prejudice is, Ratnati?
I think prejudice is a feeling of hate of people as a group or individual toward the other people.
You say a feeling of hate. Do you think prejudice is as strong as hate?
Yes. When there is somebody, if he has a prejudice, then the answer will be, I hate such and such.
Well, I suppose that is true. What do you think prejudice is, Eureka?
Well, I found that if somebody distinguish between 2 white men, it is not prejudice. But if somebody distinguish between a white man and a colored man, it is prejudice.
I would define prejudice as a rigid opinion formed about a certain thing before there has been a just examination of the facts.
When a person loses track of the dignity of the human soul and begins to judge others not on the basis of their being persons, but on the basis of race, creed, economic status, that is prejudice.
Well, is it fair to ask you whether you...
So I'm just going to pause it right there. And, you know, it was so interesting to me. Like, I know in our client work, sometimes when we are kind of eliciting definitions of, say, racism, it can be fascinating to see what people are bringing to the table, kind of like what they're perceiving the concept to be. So I wonder, Dr. Martin, if we could talk a little bit about the importance on getting on the same page, or having a common understanding of a concept, especially if we're trying to enact organizational change or even personal change.
So I really think that the power of dialogue is being in the same conversation.
Yeah.
And you can only be in the same conversation if you are using the same understanding behind the words that we're using, which is oftentimes the downfall of conversations about racism, right? Where, you know, if I think racism is about hating people, and if somebody else who I'm talking to thinks racism is a system that has all these layers, then we're not in the same conversation.
Right.
We're using the same word, but we are not in the same conversation in terms of, well, when I'm talking about what the problem is, my analysis is going to be really about, how individuals treat each other. The other person's analysis is going to be more sophisticated, right? It's going to be more complex. And I'm not going to be able to connect all the dots between what I think it is and what they think it is, even though we're using the same words. And so the same thing is happening in this conversation, where they're laying the foundation of what it means or at least what folks think it means, so that they can move forward. And as the young people shared what their definitions were, they gradually got more sophisticated, right? It started with hate, and then
Yeah.
it went all the way up to kind of the dehumanization and not acknowledging a person beyond what we can, in essence, recognize with our eyes.
Yeah. And, one of the things about the debate is it is a formal discussion. There are rules, there are norms, there are boundaries that are in place. And often when people are kind of wondering, well, how do we talk about racism? It's more kind of like that formal structured piece maybe isn't so front of mind, right? So for a lot of people, they might be imagining, like, say with their family, right? Like, oh, well, I have a racist uncle. How do I talk to him about racism? And yeah, for a relationship like that, there might not be easy ins toward, like, it might be weird to say to your uncle or family member, like, hey, would you like to have a formal discussion with me on racism? Let's prepare and let's debate, and then afterwards we can figure that out. Like, that's just simply not something that we're used to. In the workplace, we are used to more formal, structured conversations, but not necessarily for this purpose or in this particular way. And so that can also be uncomfortable. But I don't know, in your experience in working with clients, and seeing that there is a real desire for people to make change, like, have there been opportunities for people to do this in a way that wouldn't be like so uncomfortable that people kind of go running for the hills?
So the short answer is no. You can't remove the discomfort from it. But what we can do, so there's two parts to it. One, you started with the structure, right?
Mhm.
The process itself, which is one aspect. And then the second aspect is our skill, our skill set to be able
Yeah.
to be in the conversation,
Mhm.
right? And our experience level in being in these kinds of conversations. So debates in the structure provide um, some level of structure for hard conversations, and to make sure points are heard. Um, and I would say there's also a level of skill building that people go through to be able to participate in debates, to be able to maximize the opportunity they have to exchange ideas, and things like that. So I'd say in organizations, it's the same thing, right? That we
Mhm.
have the structure and we create the space for the conversations to happen, not just for the sake of conversations. Let me just be clear, not just for the sake of conversations, but for the sake of having setting the stage for there to be a common understanding so that we can move forward and figure out what do we want to do, right? So
Mhm.
there, it serves a purpose. So that is number one, that we're talking, not just to say that we have dialogues, but to as an opportunity for folks to be heard as part of something.
Yeah.
Um, and then the second piece is, I've seen um, part of the skill building process really be around self-awareness and self-management,
Mhm.
right? And understanding like our own ideas and positions and worldviews, so that when we interface with other folks and those worldviews collide, that we don't fall apart,
Right.
don't get emotional. And let me reframe, because we can get emotional, but we are able to manage ourselves through the emotion, to be able to stay engaged in the conversation. Uh,
Yeah, and I mean, to your point, when we're setting up for a dialogue, right? And when something terrible happens, the media is always calling for greater dialogue. But for somebody in the conflict resolution field, dialogue is also a formal, structured conversation, and there's a lot of preparation that has to go into it, right? So one of the things that we're coached on very early on is, as facilitators of dialogues, we have to know ourselves. We have to know what our triggers are. We have to know what we think and why we think it, because so often we are not thoughtful about these things, and that's where a lot of conflicts can kind of creep in and derail any kind of notions of creating a more positive way forward. And I think that gets glossed over a lot, unfortunately. But it's great that we have this video to kind of reference and draw parallels from. So let's take a look back at what they get up to.
Do you have any prejudices?
Well, I guess so, Mrs. Waller. And being brutally frank, I'm prejudiced against Japanese. Well, not to the extent that I hate them. No, not that way. But I got this, well, as a result of World War II. Because, well, I guess I was yet too young to understand what happened during those times. But I think that what my relatives and friends and the people who were witness to that unfaithful occasion, well, they just more than justify the fact. And I think it's justified for me to feel the same way because, well, I know that my people suffered very much under that rule.
You still as prejudiced against the Japanese as you were?
Well, 5 years ago, that prejudice of mine was, well, slightly fading away. But when Japan stubbornly refused to pay reparations to us, well, the prejudice began to brew again. But now I found out from close contact with Enrico and other Japanese that Japan isn't ready to pay reparations yet, because as Enrico said, some of them, and most of them, even have to suffer the cold in the classrooms because they can't afford to heat the schools.
Enrico, you've got any prejudices?
Well, I don't have any prejudice for Philippines, but many Japanese people hate Korea because the president of Korea made the line, his own line, on the public sea between Korea and Japan. And if the Japanese fishermen go over the line, they are caught by Korean people, and they can't go home for a while. And we are trying to be friends for Korea.
Now that we've started, we better go on around the circle. Judith, you got any prejudices that you admit?
Yes, I suppose I'd better admit them, although I'm English. I have some very foolish prejudices. You'll probably laugh. For instance, as soon as I meet a person with red hair, I always put myself on my guard because I have a silly prejudice that all red-headed people have terrible tempers, you know, that they're as passionate as the color of their hair. Oh, and then I have another silly prejudice. For example, when I first met the Australian delegate, Elizabeth Woodgate, who hasn't been on television, I was shocked by her accent because to me it sounds just like a Cockney accent would in England. And I hope I'm not conceited or anything, but a Cockney accent in England, you know, most English people would shudder a little bit when they hear it. But she very frankly told me that she shuddered when she heard my accent. So I got paid back for that too.
Why did she say she did?
Oh, I think she imagines that... she said she really had to forget my accent in order to like me, because it was too formal. I gather most Americans think about that about the English as well. So.
Ratnati, it's your turn.
Well, sometimes I find prejudice against the Dutch people when in school when I learn the history and learn how the Dutch people treated Indonesians. And I have some other prejudices of my own. That's I hate people who are proud and who feel that he is the master of the other people and who thinks that he knows everything than anybody else.
Let's come back to you a minute, Ralph. Are there any prejudices in the...
So I'll just pause the video there. And you know, for those watching who might not be aware, the Indonesian woman, when she was talking about the Dutch colonized Indonesia, and for whatever reason, that's not part of the colonial history that I certainly learned as an American student in a public school. But these kids talking about prejudice, the prejudices that they have. We talk about prejudice a lot, but we don't always dive into where prejudices come from. And the young man from the Philippines said something very interesting to me. He was saying that in some sense, he feels like his prejudices are justified. And that's something that I certainly found myself relating to because I am Filipino myself. And I also went through that experience of learning what happened in the Philippines that was done by the Japanese. And I'd also learned around that time that my grandfather was a POW. And it was a really interesting experience to ask him about his time being captured by the Japanese. And I was shocked to find that actually he didn't hold any prejudices himself, and that absolutely changed my feelings about the Japanese as well. And so it really seemed like this young man had he had these things in his mind, but in coming into contact with an actual person and finding out what their perspective was and how things are actually unfolding on their end, that really kind of changed his view. So I don't know if in your experience in working with clients, like you've gotten a sense where the prejudices that people are dealing with today kind of stem from, and that whole justification piece. I don't think that's something that people really talk about, but I think it is there for a lot.
Yeah, I would say I would make it a bit more nuanced in terms of when we talk about prejudice, what we're talking about, right? There's conscious prejudices and there's unconscious prejudices.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's some prejudices we don't even know that we have until we enter into certain situations, and we express them. And mainly because we've been exposed to so many toxic ideas about different groups of people that continuously get reinforced. Whether we believe them or not is irrelevant. It's the fact that we get exposed to them so often, and our brain catalogs the things that we get exposed to the most. And so, so I would say in terms of a lot of the growth and development, part of it is the acknowledging that we have prejudice, known and unknown, and acknowledging, and I think I've seen with clients as the light bulbs go off about some of the ideas that have been deeply held that hadn't been surfaced before, that hadn't been analyzed and probed to be able to determine kind of what is the context and the subtext, right? The context of different ideas we have about people are generally rooted in the subtext of stereotypes.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, context is the background, the stage, the setting, right? The subtext is what I'm really saying, what I really mean when I say this, even if I don't know what I mean when I'm saying it. Right. And so, and that's a part of understanding microaggressions and why they're harmful to people of color, because even if you don't know what you mean when you're saying things to people, when people let you know that they've been harmed, and it's an opportunity for us to own our impact. But ultimately, a lot of times we don't know what we don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's through these kind of dialogues and experiences and healthy conflict that we actually get the clarity.
Absolutely. And, one of the things that I've been thinking of lately is when there are microaggressions, right? There are people that are very quick to dismiss microaggressions, perhaps in part due to the name, like, oh, they're just really small things. Why are you making mountains out of molehills? But it is exhausting to go through life constantly confronted by microaggressions. Like, yes, they might be small, but in aggregate, it gets really tiring to even just mentally be like, I know that person didn't mean it like that. Or I know that, this person is saying that because they don't know certain things. I know that you're somebody that often has an internal dialogue or monologue going on. And I don't know if you've got some insight on how we can deal with these things in ways that are like maybe less exhausting or maybe like less resource intensive.
Well, I think some of it is we don't have to deal with everything, right? So like picking and choosing our battles. And I think something that James Baldwin said jumps out at me in this instance, which is you have to decide on who you are, and then you have to force the world to deal with who you are and not their idea of you.
Mm.
And so part of it is an acknowledgement that when people perpetuate microaggressions, it's not actually about me because they don't know me, right? And so there are times where really the problem is that it's about them and their lack of self-awareness, their lack of skill, knowledge, and skills around racial equity and social justice, and all of those pieces that I've been privileged enough to be able to learn and explore. And so I don't have to take on their baggage. I don't have to take on their stuff. And so there's situations where I don't even engage because for
Right.
what? Now, if it's a closer relationship, someone I'm going to have to be in, like in the workplace, right? Someone that I'm going to have to work with on a regular basis, then I am going to have that conversation and try to be as developmental as possible. And by developmental, I mean acknowledging that people, um, people are human beings, and everything that comes with that, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and that I am not better than anybody else because I am farther along in my racial equity journey. And at some point, I was still kind of struggling through the basics. And so, so for me to approach those interactions in that way frees me up from um, seeing other people as, from dehumanizing other people in the process.
Hmm.
And so, and to always kind of live my truth. I don't always speak my truth. I always live my truth, though. And so, for all of us, we have to figure out where are there opportunities for us to engage and not engage because we're just people, and the resilience well is not unlimited. In other words, it ends,
Right.
and you will burn yourself out trying to chase after every little thing until the question becomes what what are your strategies and tactics that match who you are, what kind of goals you've set for yourself around advancing racial equity and social justice, and how do you hold yourself accountable in these conversations.
Right, and I think all of that just kind of underscores the importance of collective care because, as you say, the resilience well runs dry. But sometimes, if you got friends and family around, they can give you a sip of water or tell you where the next well is.
Hmm.
And with that, let's see
Philippines
how they're
between
doing.
groups of people.
Yes, there are existing prejudices between groups of people. As a matter of fact, most of us still, well, are prejudiced against a group of hybrids, those who have more Spanish blood than Filipino blood in them, and we term them as mestizos. Well, these incidents, well, usually occur in the schools. As you know, I'm in a school run by Spanish monks, and well, we have a lot of we have a lot of those of that group studying in our school, and usually they are favored. But we think, and well, we think that we are right in saying that they are sort of aristocratic, conceited, and high-headed, and sore-headed, and all sorts of adjectives, and they have the foolish idea that they have the royal blood or royalty in them.
Well, how do you get along with these boys in school, Raul? Are there any problems?
Well, frankly speaking, I don't get along with them pretty well. As a matter of fact, well, we usually fight with one another.
Is there any problem? Yes, Eureka.
Yes, Japan have had many American or European soldiers after the war, and most of them married with Japanese girls, not only formal wedding, and they made children who called hybrids. And I think the hybrids have nothing to be punished, but some grown-ups didn't used to treat as the Japanese children. And grown-ups also used to treat the mothers of children. Um, oh, Japanese people thought that the mothers of hybrids are not good. They are horrible because they married with foreign people, foreign boys, and many Japanese people don't like to marry with foreign people because they have they live in different customs and they consider with different ways.
You
I'm
still
so
have
curious
a strong,
about this
may I
population
say,
that she's talking about,
prejudice in
'cause
Japan
I'd never heard of it
against marrying
before.
people from other countries, don't you?
Mm.
Well, yes.
Eureka,
Yeah.
could you tell us something about the status of women in Japan? We hear the strangest things, and you've been telling me the strangest things. Could you tell us more
Well,
about it?
Before the war?
Yes, and now. Or before
Well, up to about 60 years ago, Japanese people thought that the white people are horrible because they are almost red hairs and everything is so big and about bodies. And quite a few people still think so. And in Japan, we think that something to be beautiful must be small and delicate.
You could hardly apply the word delicate to some of the big soldiers we sent to Japan, could you? But I never knew that you looked down on us because we were big. That's very interesting.
we're always proud of if the Western men are tall and handsome. We consider
are
that yes.
Oh, we're proud to be small and delicate.
What you said about skin color, Eureka, I've heard that the Chinese speak about us as pink people instead of white people. It's so much more difficult to be proud of being a pink person, isn't it?
Oh, yes, you're a pink person.
Might as well face it, Judith. Here we are.
I feel scarlet.
Ratnati, let's get...
I
Yes?
would ask Judith. Judith, since Philippines has so many colonies and, well, let's say, nearly in all over the world, how do you feel towards the people in the colonies? Do you have some prejudice?
No, I personally don't have any prejudice. At least I hope I don't. But I know that a lot of Europeans think of the Asians, for example, as rather lazy. I don't mean to be rude, but that used to be the impression we had. You know, when we started our colonization, we thought we were doing good to you. I know that you disliked, for example, in Indonesia, you disliked the Dutch there. But they probably thought they were helping you.
They were not helping us. See, you mentioned that we are lazy. We are not exactly lazy, but they didn't give us a chance, see? And we didn't get experiments to build our country.
Well, Judy, I don't think all Asians are lazy.
No, please, you're misunderstanding me. I said that was a general opinion. Maybe not now, I hope certainly not.
General opinion, but, well, when it's not, it's, well, sort of wrong to say that they're lazy. Let's just say that they've got very flat feet that they can't lift them up. Because you've got to consider, for example, the climate in most of the regions in Asia. Well, it's just but natural. You can't just work with all the warm climate around you. Of course, you'd always feel like fanning yourself or going to an air-conditioned theater or something else where it's cold.
Is there not
Okay. Well, lots to unpack there.
Yeah, Mona Ray had kind of probably had a reaction that many people had, which is the quote about from the UK participant that she didn't have any prejudice, not to be rude, but it's a common idea that Asians are lazy.
Not
And
me,
she said,
but
oh boy, it's a common idea though, or it used to be.
right.
And
Yes.
she hopes it's not anymore.
I was also struck by the host, right? So she said, "Oh, it's much harder to be proud of being a pink person than it is to be proud of being a white person." It's like, where's that coming from, ma'am? Well, I think we know, but yeah, in general response, Dr. Martin, there was a lot in there kind of about status quo ideas, right? And even leading up to that, it was kind of interesting to see from the various high school students, like what their status quo was in their local context and kind of the reactions of people once that had been violated. But yeah, it was so interesting that they brought it back, the Indonesian woman, to like, well, hey, status quo. Speaking of the status quo, what's up, Miss? What's her name from England?
Yeah, I really think that there's a thread running through. I did want to add context. So I think what most people don't realize about the world is that every country on the face of this planet, except for 14, were colonized by a European country. Every country on Earth was colonized, officially colonized by a European country, except 14. And even there's questionable about the 14, like they weren't officially colonized,
Right.
but like Japan's technically not on the list.
Somehow, but contact with the Portuguese, the English, and the Americans.
Right.
No.
So, and I bring that up because you begin to hear some of the impacts of colonization happening in countries, like this idea of from some perspectives within a country, because I also want to be clear, like these young people don't represent all perspectives from their countries.
Of course.
And in some circles, it's like some prejudice against people who are mixed with European ancestry. But then you also have in other circles in some of those countries where like that was a plus.
Mm-hmm.
And it meant that you got privileges. And actually in most countries, if you are, the lighter you are, the more privileges and the more status in society you have. And so there's a connection there that although kind of this debate is talking about some of the initial frustrations with kind of that kind of the European influence, and that when the young man from the Philippines was talking about kind of the students, even though he kind of like caricaturized all of them into one lot and they're all this and they're all that, the thing that he did talk about is that they are favored, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they're going to a school that is ran by Spanish monks.
That's right.
And they have more Spanish in them, and therefore, they're better than the other students.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's going to cause friction and tension, regardless of, whether or not you agree or disagree with his characterizations of them. But ultimately, like the favoritism shows up. And we see it in lots of different contexts. The other thing I'll point out is the young lady from the UK, consistently throughout the conversation is using language that is anchoring or centering kind of the United Kingdom as the bar of normalcy.
Right.
So she referred to things that the young lady who was from Japan had described as strange.
Mm-hmm.
Told me
Right.
some
You could tell me the
things.
strangest things.
Yes, and well, strange from her context, right, and therefore some abnormal.
Mm-hmm.
And so you get this kind of colonial dominance showing up in the conversation in these very subtle ways, which brings me to my final point that when you think about prejudice, it is not an island unto itself, right? Like prejudice, there's prejudices that we have that are like because of life experiences, and those types of prejudices occur. Some of us don't like the dark. Some of us don't like, when we see people with certain clothes on because it reminds us of this moment. But the majority of our prejudices are actually socialized into us.
Right.
We learned them. That's why there's so many of the same prejudices. Like it's not like we didn't all just individually come up with the same ideas on our own. We were taught them.
Mm-hmm.
And those systemically reinforced prejudices and the idea of there being kind of these ideas that infect us, that influence how we interact and influence how we structure policies and who we think deserves what or doesn't deserve something or is valuable or not valuable. That part of that part is missing from this conversation, right? Like up to this point, we've talked about prejudice as something that is an individual thing solely.
Right.
But there's a systemic context, there's a social context, there's a structural context.
Yeah, and like definitely in the workplace, right? So if organizations are embedded in communities, and the communities, especially in the US, are all informed by a culture that stems from European colonialism, then it's not that much of a stretch to say or to draw that connection between colonialism and business. And quite frankly, that is the way that colonialism is being enacted today, right? Our workplace cultures and norms have been exported to pretty much every country on earth. And now when people expect to do business internationally, there is a sense that it will conform to European, if not American, norms and standards. And so when we start talking about things like culture fit, it seems as if we're talking about an organizational culture fit, but if we contextualize it, it's actually a broader cultural fit as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if you're not part of the dominant culture one way or another, be you an international person or somebody who's not from a dominant group within the US or in a European country, then it just may be that you don't fit into the workplace culture either.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. And it's not, so there's the identities we hold, and then there's the ideas that we have internalized. And so when we have internalized a lot of whiteness as a concept, as these ideals, as people of color, right? We show up in workplaces and can be reinforcing the same systems and ideas and going along with things that are actually harmful to us in the pursuit of trying to be successful,
Right.
in the pursuit of trying to be a good fit, right? You have to, in order to fit into something, you have to give something up.
That's right.
There's always a trade-off. And so when we're not clear about the trade-off we're making, we oftentimes find ourselves no longer clear about who we are and and therefore who we want to be or who we're trying to be. So it's easier to just follow a script. It's easier to go along, to get along and just fit in so that you don't have to experience any friction. Challenge with that is we meaning all of us, people of color, white people, end up kind of just reinforcing the system and keep holding it up, even though we don't know that that's what we're doing and we don't mean to.
Right.
Just by virtue of like trying to fit in, trying to conform to standards that actually don't apply to us. They don't apply to white people.
Yeah.
And they don't apply to us in terms of in terms of the source of those ideas. Like I didn't come up with those ideas, right? The most present day white people didn't come up with those ideas about how we're supposed to be, but we've internalized them. And so now we're showing up in these spaces and having to like peel those layers back to really figure out, like, if I remove all of this, these socialized layers that I have on top of me, like what's under there? Like, who am I really?
Right.
I'm not just a Black woman, right? I am I'm a photographer. I'm a nerd. I'm an introvert. I have all these different parts of my identity. And even then, that is not who I am.
Right.
Those are just different parts. Right? And so, the challenge with racism and buying into whiteness is that we give up a lot of ourselves and we lose our independence and and therefore our ability to fully connect with each other.
Yeah.
Right. If I'm not connected to me, it's harder for me to be connected to you.
Absolutely. And, I think it was pretty clear from what you were saying, but just to re-emphasize, and we do say it a lot, but this absolutely, of course, impacts white people too, right? So buying into whiteness also harms white people, also prevents them from being the full, wonderful humans that they are. So
Yeah, it's
Only
blocked
just
our
difference of
all of
climate
us reaching
that
our full
explains,
potential.
a difference in
100%,
tempo,
yeah.
but is there a difference in philosophy, too, that perhaps we in the West haven't appreciated, I wonder?
Well, as far as I know it, and, well, I think you've mentioned it in this program, that Indians think that they should never soil their hands. And in the Philippines, I must admit that, well, we're sort of inclined to get white-collar jobs and swivel chairs. Most of us do, especially the new college graduates. We don't want to work with our hands. We want to have, well, big bosses and with pretty secretaries around us. That's the common tendency.
A sign of the times.
Could you give a proof that we are lazy?
Oh, gosh, now you put me in a corner. I was trying to give you an example. You criticize the countries which do, you criticize the Dutch, for example, but I know the British, when they started doing their colonization, they tried to help the countries they were in. But you think that we were butting in and taking away your opportunities?
Well, yes, I think so. I'll give an example about the Dutch, that we didn't get a chance to be educated, for example.
That was when the Dutch were there?
Yeah. And do you think if the people in the colony get a chance to get free, you will give them? Do you think?
Oh, now we're going right off the subject.
Yeah. See, my friend from Malaya is very glad that Malaya will get the independence next year. She's very proud, and she tells everybody that Malaya is going to be independent next year. Do you think that if you do that to the other places, then you
Yes,
you'll make them satisfied?
Well, we hope it will make them satisfied. Every country wants to be independent. That's only natural. But there comes a point somebody to decide whether they're ready to receive their independence. But I know we could go off on another long argument about that.
Maybe we can have what, I'm sorry, Ralph.
Well, I was about to ask them, what do they think are the most common or basic causes of our prejudices? Is it mainly skin color?
Well, maybe.
I'm going to skip ahead a little.
Racial segregation or something like that. But
Evidences of racial prejudice in the United States. But I found out that most Negroes are laborers, and they don't have a high position on business. But I was very glad when I saw the Negro girl in South Orange in Columbia High School, who was the vice president of the student council.
I'm glad you did, too. Yes, Ratna.
Here in New York and New Jersey, I don't see any racial segregation or something like that. But when we stop in Williamsburg and we stop in Negro school, I saw it's very strictly. I mean, the Negro school go to the special Negro, and I was talking to some of the girls in the school, and I asked them how they feel about being segregated. But they said that they don't mind about that, and what they want is equal rights. And there are some places that they can go, such as restaurant or some clubs. And I think that since all Americans claim and emphasize that America is the most democratic country in the world, and as long as segregation exists, I don't think it's a democratic. I mean, pure democratic.
Well, adding something to that, isn't it that, well, in the Pledge of Allegiance to the American flag, you mentioned something about, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation indivisible under God, with liberty and justice for all. Well, the last phrase just doesn't suit everything. I mean, with this segregation problem here and the discrimination against colored people, how in the world could you have liberty and justice for all? And in one of my hospitality periods, I didn't expect that even the kids could carry it that far. I had the, well, privilege, I should say, of attending one of the dances sponsored by one of the civic groups. And I just noticed that, well, it was a big dance floor, and all the white kids were assembled on the left side, and the most, well, shall we say, not strategic part of the ballroom, well, all the colored boys and girls were in there. And I never saw a white boy asking a colored girl for a dance, nor did I see a colored boy asking a white girl for a dance.
I had a nasty experience too. When I first arrived here and I happened to mention to a group of young people that I was going to stay with a Negro family, one of the boys got up and walked out of the room. And I felt awful. I thought, well, we're in the north now, not in the south. And then when we did go into the south, I really came against it pretty hard. We went into this big store, and I was in the ladies' cloakroom, and I was washing my hands, and I was with a group of the eastern delegates, the rather darker-skinned ones like Ratnati. And I was standing a little apart from them, and this lady came up to me, and she pulled me to one side, obviously assuming that I was American, and she said, what are these Negroes doing in here? And I was so cross, and I told her as calmly as I could that I was with them and who we were, and of course her attitude immediately changed. But it gives you such a nasty shock when you come up against it face to face. You read about it in the newspapers, you hear about it, but you don't really realize the significance of it until it hits you in the face yourself.
I think the major cause of the prejudice is skin colors, and I think I don't know why, but I think the white people think that colored people have dirty skin, and they don't have progressive culture, so the white people are the most great and wonderful person in the world. I think so.
On this matter of skin color, if you were here in the summer, you'd see lots of Americans on all the beaches trying to get brown.
It's significant.
I wonder what that...
So I'll just pause the video there, and for those who are just kind of tuning in, those kids were just talking about kind of where prejudice comes from, and one of the conclusions that they seemed to reach was that skin color is a source of prejudice. You know, the other thing that I kind of want to pick up on is that let me take this video away, is that they were talking about their various experiences with race in the U.S. and they were kind of expressing some shock at they read about it in the newspaper, and it was a very different experience to kind of see it for themselves. Today it's a very different context, but there are still a lot of people, especially in the US, who have heard about racism. They agree that it's an important issue to address, but maybe they haven't really seen it for themselves. And the young woman from the UK, she expressed shock, like she saw it happen, and she didn't mention that she did anything, right? And there are a lot of people who are kind of like, I saw something that was a clear example of racism and I did nothing. And there's like some there's definitely some guilt that's often attached to that. And I wonder if in our limited time, we can just kind of talk about that a little bit, because we're talking about engaging in debate and being skilled and setting the stage to have hard conversations that are productive to address prejudice and racism. But for all of that, and people do understand that a bit, maybe you can talk a little bit about the skill that is involved in showing up and being able to act when we do see something.
Mm-hmm. So first, let me say a commentary about what we just observed. So first of all, we're talking about a group of folks who are debating about prejudice and about kind of racism and how it shows up. And just want to highlight the fact that there's still, even then in the 50s, there was this idea that racism only existed in the South. And so everyone's shocked that it happens up north. So I just wanted to reinforce that. But also this idea that that basically youth, young people can look at the situation and see the hypocrisy in what we say we stand for as a country versus how we treat people and what we do, right? So and this is relevant to organizations because there's the values that we aspire to, that we say, that we have written, that we share with folks to advertise what wonderful people and organizations we are. But then there's what we do and how we operate every day. And when there's a discrepancy between the two, there's a particularly unique bond that is broken, or trust that is broken, when, especially for people of color who go into an organization thinking that it's going to be one way and finding out it's something different. And I think many of us have shown up in spaces and felt that way. Um, and it leads to all types of challenges that I won't go into right now. But one I will mention is called betrayal trauma. And it's this idea that it is that the organizations that we depend on or that we expect to provide security or safety for us when we need them, and they don't do those things. In fact, they cause harm. It leads to a different kind of impact. Now, betrayal trauma isn't a kind of trauma in and of itself. It's the experience that it speaks to of what happens when the systems and structures and organizations we depend on for our livelihoods and for our safety and security do harm to us.
Yeah.
And so when we think about the question that you asked that I've forgotten because I just spoke too long about that. Ask your question again.
I forgot it too, but
Okay.
I think it had to be around skill building, right?
Oh, yes, skill building.
And
Yeah.
showing up and like being able to act in the
Yes.
moment, right?
Yes. And so the question, the thing that I always try to remind us, because you brought up kind of like shame and guilt when
Mhm.
we don't take action,
Yeah.
when we observe something, whether we're on the receiving end of it or whether we witness it. There's a shame that happens and a guilt that happens. And if you're the person of color who's experiencing it, it's a even deeper level of internal conflict. Um, all of that to say, the skills that help us are understanding racism, what it is, how it works, opportunities to advance racial equity. What does that look and feel like? How we also are looking at the historical context, how we got to where we are, because without that context, we don't understand the complexity. We don't understand all of the moving pieces. And then the other skills that are important are emotional intelligence, communication skills, not just interpersonal and organizational skills, but also intrapersonal skills. That's what we were talking about earlier, our conversations with ourselves and how we
Yeah.
manage ourselves. Conflict management, your area of expertise, Rico.
Yeah.
Our ability to not allow conflict to get in the way of our relationships and our lives and our goals and everything we're trying to accomplish in life. And the last one is critical thinking. The fact that we're wired a certain way, we're socialized a certain way, and ultimately, because of that, we have these missteps we make in our thinking. And so without having tools to manage the way we think about things, we oftentimes are perpetuating inequities without meaning to do it. We're oftentimes making assumptions about people without actually being able to connect the dots to who they really are, because we're too busy in our internal monologue, lost in our assumptions, that we don't create the space to be curious and to be surprised, and get to know people for who they really are.
Yeah. And, for those at home who are watching and kind of wondering where they can learn more about all of those things, well, we're lucky that Dr. Martin has written a wonderful book called We Are the Question Plus the Answer. I don't know if you want to say a little something about that and where people can get it before we go.
Sure. You can go on Amazon.com or you can go on bookshop.org and order your copy. And I would also invite you to intentionallyact.com. We are super excited about some new experiences and opportunities that will be coming up in the next month that we'll be sharing with you. And just really thank you to everyone for joining us today. I feel incredibly blessed. Thank you, Rico, for coming up with this idea for us to preview. And looking forward to seeing what else we can do, what other kind of experiments we can do to share with people the different ways of thinking and approaching the work.
Well, thank you, Dr. Martin. Also, credit to Miles because he was a big part of putting this idea together and thinking of everything as well. And if you're watching, you like this video, then please do like and share. And we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot, everybody.